Up to this point, we've talked about prayer as this conversation between us and God. I recognize that he's near. He loves me. And I get to talk to him. And prayer is that word that we've placed on communication with the divine, communication with the supernatural. Prayer is that word that we've given to this conversation. And we now have a few different foundational prayers that we've been introduced to. The first connected us across history to our early brothers and sisters. And it was when we considered the prayer of Ignatius. It was called the Examen. And I love, again, how his examen is laid out. First, I feel God's nearness. And the second step before I start to problem solve is to just look at my blessings. Let's look at how good things are before I get into how bad things are. And so I love how that's laid out. And it connects us across history to the early church. Connecting us back to Jesus, we've been directed a few times to the Lord's Prayer. That is also a foundational prayer, a format that we can use. And last week, Amy did a great job of directing us back to the Old Testament and the Psalms. The Psalms, again, are those great foundational prayers that we can go back to and we can read them and pray them. So we have these foundational prayers, and on top of the prayer foundation, though, we did consider, like Mr. Potato Head, who was up here for a while, he always has these different accessories you can dress him up with. And so you can accessorize your prayer as needed at times. Sometimes something comes up and you say, okay, this isn't something that I regularly pray through or experience, but I'm going to dress up my prayer today because I need to deal with this. And some of those things are confession. I don't necessarily feel every single time I talk to God, I confess something major. But there can be a time where as I follow the journey, something in my life comes up and I go, oh, I want to confess this. I want to deal with this. And so this is something that can be an accessory to prayer. We dealt with intercession. At times, I realize a need outside of myself for someone else, and I intercede for them. So intercession is an accessory to prayer. And then we also considered petition. Petition is kind of the idea when I have a need, and I go to petition God for help with my need. And as of last week, we're concluding the series by wrapping up some final questions. Or thoughts or loose ends, whatever kind of didn't fit into the rest of the sermon series. And this week we're going to consider the labor of prayer. Many of you know my own story. At the end of my rope, God's voice reaches out to me and I follow it. And for 3 weeks, I followed it. The first Sunday after I heard his voice, I Googled a local church. I'm like, I will find somewhere to go to church. And I went and I thought, not bad. I guess it was a good service. I don't know enough to know. And the voice says that, nope, sorry, not for you. And so the second Sunday, I Googled another church and I show up and I was like, that wasn't bad either, I guess. But the voice said no. Third Sunday, I end up at a church and the voice takes me to a church where I enter and the voice says, this is it. This is the church you're supposed to be at. And I would find out later that was the church that had been praying for me for 10 years. What was for me the start of something, the start of life with God, was for others the culmination of years of working and laboring in prayer for me. So today, we're going to look at the work involved in prayer. Prayer isn't always just fun and exciting. It's not always glamorous, and it's not always something that enraptures us and keeps our attention. For this, I want to look at a story from the life of Elijah. And so, for context, there's a drought in Israel. Ahab is king at this time. And for the sake of a political alliance, he marries Jezebel, a foreign woman, the daughter of a foreign king. King Ahab is a weak person, and Queen Jezebel comes in to run the show. She brings with her the worship of the god Baal. And she turns Israel from the worship of Yahweh, which they were already kind of mediocre on anyway, and she introduces the worship of Baal. Jezebel's Baal worship is going to go head to head against the worship of Yahweh and Elijah. I do want to note that people in Scripture are they're a lot deeper than one dimension that we can get from them sometimes. On Jezebel's side, you're going to find a highborn woman whose role was typically as a political pawn to be married away for political gain. She's thrust into a patriarchal world, to a foreign land. On Elijah's side, we're going to find a depressed prophet who appears generally to be in a bad mood. And he will apparently make some very significant errors in judgment and action during his service to Yahweh. So while we like to think of Jezebel as the bad person, we can consider some of the circumstances she was caught up in as a pawn in a patriarchal world. And while we can always picture Elijah as the good guy, it's also important to realize he had his own flaws. And these characters are multidimensional. With this context in place, though, with some dimension given to the characters, let's go to the story of Elijah. And so things come to a head in 1 Kings chapter 18. We're going to look at verses 16 through 39. And it says, when Obadiah went and informed Ahab, the king went to meet Elijah. When Ahab saw Elijah, he said to him, "Is it really you, the one who brings disaster on Israel?" Elijah replied, "I have not brought disaster on Israel, but you and your father's dynasty have, by abandoning the Lord's commandments and following the Baals. Now send out messengers and assemble all Israel before me at Mount Carmel, as well as the 450 prophets of Baal and 400 prophets of Asherah, whom Jezebel supports." Ahab sent messengers to all the Israelites and had the prophets assemble at Mount Carmel. Elijah approached all the people and said, "How long are you going to be paralyzed by indecision? If the Lord is the true God, then follow him. But if Baal is the true God, then follow him." But the people did not say a word. Elijah said to them, "I am the only prophet of the Lord who's left. But there are 450 prophets of Baal. Let them bring us 2 bulls. Let them choose 1 bull for themselves, cut it up into pieces, and place it on the wood of an altar. But they must not set it on fire. I will do the same with the other bull and place it on the wood, and I will not set a fire. Then you will invoke the name of your God, and I will invoke the name of the Lord. The God who responds with fire will be demonstrated as the true God." And the people said, "Seems like a fair test." So there we go. This is where we are, going head to head. And so the prophets of Baal are going to have a showdown with Elijah, the prophet of Yahweh. So Elijah told the prophets to go ahead and choose their bull. So they took a bull, as he had suggested, and they prepared it. They invoked the name of Baal from morning until noon, saying, "Baal, answer us." But there was no sound and no answer. They jumped around on the altar they had made, and at noon Elijah mocked them. "Yell louder. After all, he is a god. He might be deep in thought. Or perhaps he stepped out for a moment and is taking a trip. Perhaps he's sleeping and he needs to be awakened." So they yelled louder. And in accordance with their prescribed ritual, they mutilated themselves with swords and spears until their bodies were covered with blood. Throughout the afternoon, there was an ecstatic frenzy, but no sound, no answer, no response. Elijah then told the people, approach me. So all the people approached him. He repaired the altar of the Lord that had been torn down. Then Elijah took 12 stones, corresponding to the number of the tribes of Israel that descended from Jacob, to whom the Lord's message had come. Israel will be your name. With the stones, he constructed an altar for the Lord. Around the altar, he made a trench large enough to contain 2 seahs of seed. I don't know how big a seah is, but look. He arranged the wood, cut up the bowl, and placed it on the wood. Then he said, fill 4 water jars and pour the water on the offering in the wood. I want to pause here for a moment. When I first read this, I thought, he's up in the ante. Not only are we going to call down fire to burn this, but we're going to wet the wood down. Like, we're going to make this even harder for God. Let me just show you how good my God is. But when you read the story, what he's doing is he's offering something that's most precious to them right now. They're in a drought. So the water is not upping the ante all the time. Water is adding to the offering to God. Then he said, fill 4 water jars and pour the water on the wood, on the offering in the wood. When they had done so, he said, do it again. So they did it again. Then he said, do it a 3rd time. So they did it a 3rd time. Precious water being given to God. When it was time for the evening offering, Elijah the prophet approached the altar and prayed, O Lord God of Abraham, Isaac, and Israel, prove today that you are God in Israel and that I am your servant and have done all these things at your command. Answer me, O Lord, answer me, so these people will know that you, O Lord, are the true God and that you are winning back their allegiance. Then fire from the Lord fell from the sky. It consumed the offering, the wood, the stones, and the dirt, and licked up the water in the trench. When all the people saw this, they threw themselves down with their faces to the ground. The Lord is the true God. The Lord is the true God. And yes, we have what we want now. God in power making a grand display. We have the powerful sign of God that amazes everyone. Such a grand display that, in fact, James and John tried to recreate the event to a degree when Jesus was on earth. Jesus is rejected by a village. And in Luke chapter 9, verses 54 through 56, it says, now when his disciples, James and John, saw that Jesus had been rejected by the village, they said, Lord, do you want us to call down fire from heaven and consume them? And Jesus turned and rebuked them. And they went on to another village. I imagine Jesus didn't get too angry. I could just see him just shaking his head and go, are you stupid? Is that what I came to do? Let's go. But humans are drawn by big, flashy, shiny things. But what we see time and again is that the grand displays, the powerful experiences are not where life is actually born and sustained. And it's no different in Elijah's powerful moment. Time and again, you will see humanity recognize something big and powerful, and it leaves their memory a short time later. The awe falls away, and they revert back to the things they did. The sustenance of life is not there. In Elijah's powerful moment, the crowd goes wild. God chalks up a W. But you still have a withering people in a land with drought. The sustenance of life is missing. Powerful moments, they do fade quickly, and we're going to be coming up on Palm Sunday. where people flocked to Jesus' arrival and praised him as king. A huge, powerful moment. And only a short time later, they'll be chanting for his death and saying, "We have no king but Caesar." So the powerful moment falls away. I want to consider where life and the sustained life is to really be found. Let's go back to Elijah's story in 1 Kings 18. The showdown is over. God is proven. But we'll see that life arrives actually on the back of slow, steadfast, faithful praying. After the showdown, Elijah told Ahab, "Go on up and eat and drink, for the sound of a heavy rainstorm can be heard." Now, prophets were actually, they were often in tune with something that was coming. They would see visions, they would hear from God. They knew what was coming. And so what we'll find out from the story is that there was no rain to be heard. There was no rainstorm for others to hear. Ahab didn't even hear it. But Elijah was hearing something in his spirit. Elijah's prophetically hearing something, and he has faith that will come. So Ahab went on up to eat and drink, while Elijah climbs to the top of Carmel. Elijah bends down towards the ground and put his face between his knees. He told his servant, "Go on up and look in the direction of the sea." So he, the servant, went on up and looked and reported, "Nothing." 7 times Elijah sends him to look. The 7th time, the servant says, "Oh, look, a small cloud. It's about the size of my hand. There's something. It's rising from the sea." And Elijah then said, "Go and tell Ahab, hitch up the chariots and go down so that the rain will not overtake you. Here it comes." This is the prayer of life. While King Ahab is heading out to go feast, while the crowds who God had just proven himself to all scatter to go about their regular lives, Elijah goes to pray at a place with no spotlight. There's no glamour for him in this time of prayer. It's been remarked as odd that Elijah's prayer posture is detailed here as having his head between his knees. Praying people in Scripture are described as bowing, as kneeling, as even laying flat on the ground. So this is the only description of praying like this. As we've seen in many of our Bible studies, the details are not there for no reason. One of the most popular topics I've spoken on was the bread that John remarks on, and how John looks at the details of the bread that Jesus multiplies. The details matter, and so we're meant to learn something from the detail. Elijah's praying from what would have been the ancient birthing position. And he's praying for the birth of something. Rain, new life. He has physically assumed the position of a woman giving birth. He's no longer in the glamorous position before the crowds. He's not even in a glamorous position at all. He has literally sequestered himself into the position of laboring in prayer for life to come. You can imagine he's probably pretty ready for this to end and his prayer to be answered. And from this position, down on the ground, a womanly position, that'd be hard in a patriarchal world, From this position, he asks his servant, go look, see if it's happening yet. Go look for the rain that I'm praying to birth. And the servant comes back to Elijah and lets him know, nothing there, boss. Okay. So Elijah keeps at his work of praying for life to come to the people. 7 times the servant goes to check for rain. And on the last time he comes back and says, there's a cloud out there. It's pretty small though. But Elijah knows that that cloud is the answer to his persistent prayer. I can personally just imagine the snap, crackle, pop of his knees as he tries to get up. After being down in this position. And he tells his servant to go let Ahab know. The rain's coming. Elijah's unnoticed, patient prayers had birthed life. God can be seen in the big and powerful, the signs and the wonders. But more often than not, the life-giving, powerful, effective prayers will take place away from the spotlight by people laboring with persistence, while others have left. King Ahab to the feast, others to their lives, and a committed few stubbornly persisting in prayer. Plenty of people want to be there when the cool stuff happens, when the fire comes down, and they even want to recreate it, like James and John. Let's do this again. This is the cool stuff. Plenty of people want to be there, but far fewer want to maintain faithfulness to the day in and day out. Unnoticed, unglamorous, laborious prayers that I believe are actually the ones that birth and sustain life. And it's hard. Jesus asked his disciples near the end of his life, will you come and labor with me in prayer ahead of my death? And they fell asleep. It's hard, but the reward is great. The church labored for me for 10 years. Me personally, that reward's great. I'm living and breathing today. I'm very thankful for that. But the reward is life. And I thank God that church labored for me for 10 years. In prayer that wasn't, you didn't see it on national news. It was not in any spotlight. And I thank God that there are those who continue to labor for me and to sustain my life in prayer. I do want you guys to know that I labor for each and every one of you in prayer. I don't say that for recognition, but I want to reassure you, any of you that may feel alone and wonder who labors for me. You got one right here. And if a lone person of Elijah can labor in prayer to bring life to a nation, trust that even if you think I'm the only one praying for you, a lone person might be able to help bring some life to this little group here.